Okay, so here is some of the pedals that I'm using in front of my amp. This is the Swiss thing, which allows you to run to two different amps if you want, and also run multiple pedals and turn them on and off at the same time. It's a really cool pedal. Sometimes I use it to actually capture the amp as well as DI at the same time, which is kind of cool to have if you want to reamp later. Of course, using a tuner, having that handy is always good. But into the chain of what I'm using, here I'm using this VFE pedal. It's a standout pedal. And what it does is it basically is a filter. So if anybody's familiar with mixing or any ideas like that, it really can help shape your sound for your pickups. So if your pickups are too boomy or have a lot of low end, you can cut some of the low end. And then the top end, if maybe your pickups are a bit shrill, you can go in and change that as well. And then bring back up the level. I find that this is probably my favorite pedal. That's probably an always-on pedal that you could probably use if you can get it. I know that the guy that runs the company is in Washington, and he's a school teacher, but he also makes pedals, and I think he stopped doing some of it because of his son having some issues, and he had some surgery or whatever, and I guess things are good now, but he's revamping another company, and I'm not sure if he's going to keep making these pedals or not, but if you can get your hands on one of these, or eventually he said something about a third-party group maybe doing some of these pedals, so I would be on the lookout and check and see and find all the information. But this pedal, in my opinion, is probably the best one, and you could actually just use this pedal by itself to get most of what you're kind of going for to shape your sound. Next is the Empress EQ, and really what it is allowing you to add some missing gaps or taking away some things that you may or may not like from your pickups. So all it is really just think of it as just something that you could do to enhance your sound. There's no right or wrong. It's all personal taste. But this right here can really, between these two, these can shape your pickups before you hit distortion. The next things in the chains are kind of extras that really aren't needed but can add a little bit extra compactness and weight to your sound and making your playing a little more consistent, and it's between these two compressors. One is like a multi-band, really, if you have it set up a certain way, but really these things are just helping control some of the dynamics. If you have pickups that are very high output, you may choose not to use it, and because you're using high gain sound, you really don't need this. This is an extra, but it does help kind of tame some of the transient. Or if you want to have it the way I'm using it is where you're accentuating the transient and having a little bit of sustain or slow or fast release. I mean, that way that you're basically accentuating that transient, and then when you do that, if anybody's familiar with mixing, it can help when you hit distortion or saturation to give the character of the sound more weight and just sound fuller and also have that transient at the same time. And that's between these two pedals. The Harlow is adding a little bit more compression and a little bit more drive very mildly. And then the Horizon Devices is just helping shape the sound, giving it the overdrive between. So all these things, it's up to you how you want to use it. You could really just use this overdrive pedal and maybe stack pedals. All these things there's many things you can go about to do it, and I'm going to show you a demonstration of what they sound and what they can do. And my guess is just try and see what works for you, because maybe your setup is different, or maybe you have different pickups. There's all kind of things. I've told people I'm kind of like a mad scientist sometimes, and I'm always trying different things out to see what works. And the last pedal is kind of a cool thing to do, is putting a octave effect, which gives you kind of a running bass line with whatever you're playing. And this could be cool to use when you're stacking parts if you're recording, and blend them in low in the mix. And then, of course, I have a gate at the very end. So all of these things are going into the invective, and I have everything kind of set, mainly close to noon. I've got 6 and 4 and 6 for the crunch channel, and then you've got presence and depth. I've got the depth up and the presence, It doesn't really matter how this is set up because your pickups can dictate it, as well as there's so many things. So you just have to try out and see what works for you. I'm not saying this is the best thing to do, but this is what seems to work for me. So let's look at an example of how it sounds and what you can get from using these things. Okay, so this is basically a graph to kind of show what I'm talking about when it comes to the pedal. So if anybody is familiar with mixing, this plugin here is FabFilter. It's used for mixing, for EQing sounds and different things, but you can use this beforehand. Let's say you're reamping your tracks before you send in the amp. You could actually use this to tighten up the sound before you hit the amp. And I wanted to show this because it's visual. It's very good to see exactly what's going on. So, for example, if you cut anywhere from 80 to like 100 hertz, you're going to get rid of kind of useless information that's going to affect how the sound of your amp is. So if you're using an EQ pedal, what I find is by shaving off this automatically around 5K, even down to 3K, and this from 80 to 100 is going to help a lot. Now, if you want it to get more aggressive, then I would move this up to anywhere to like 300, 200 to 300. That's going to help out a lot. So if you've never tried this out, try it out and see if it helps you. And then on the top end, I would say if your pickups are shrill or harsh, then I would definitely use the high cut feature, just because it really helps get rid of some of the spikiness and ear piercing shrill that can come from being on the top end. And I would go even as far as like 3K. This is all to taste. If you keep moving up this filter, you're going to get a really tight and aggressive sound that maybe you may like. And if you keep going further up, you almost get like a cocked wah kind of sound, which can be cool to have for effect, or if you like how that sounds. And it gives you a really aggressive kind of high gain tone if that's what you're going for. And then this is an example of using, let's say if I'm cutting, I would usually cut this around 400. So if I'm using like the crunch channel on the Invective, I would cut up about this high because I feel like it tightens it up, and you can even go further. There's nothing wrong with that. And cut this, and then this is what the parametric EQ is doing. So if you wanted to boost 6 dB at 1400 or 2K, you're going to find that that's going to add a lot more aggression and more clarity to your sound. And 800 is a good mid-range area to boost, as well as 250 if you're wanting your palm mutes to sound a little bit better. Because what happens if you cut so much low end, you start to lose some of the body of the sound, which isn't a bad thing, but you can add some of this back to kind of help that. But just using an EQ, once you've done this, you're going to notice the sound can be quite quiet comparative. So then I would come in here and basically boost up the level to get it back to, or it has a feature of using auto gain. But if you don't want to use that, don't trust it, then use your ears and basically bring back up the level. This by itself is got to be one of the coolest features, I would say, of using pre-EQ before your distortion. You can also use it in your effects loop. That's an interesting way to help out your sound as well. But I wanted to show this visual because it is really cool, and you can have a lot of fun with doing this. If you're not a guy like me that likes to tweak, then maybe this might not be fun for you. But I would say if you're going for a specific sound, try doing this, because if this here, you can affect your pickup. So let's say your pickups already have so much mid-range, then you can actually do the opposite and dial it back a little bit. But if you're going and hitting a amp, the front end of the amp hard, I would say try boosting around here. And these are not set frequencies. You can try different ones. Let's say you're not going for an aggressive sound. Let's say you just set this around 100 just to cut the lows of the lows. And let's say you want your amp to sound a little bit warmer. Maybe it sounds too harsh. You can boost around 100. And you can let this come back or go forward depending on how harsh you want your sound before it hits the distortion. And you can dial back this or just get rid of it and just give these kind of boosts. If you want it to be, if your amp is a little bit muddy sounding, and let's say you don't want to cut all the lows, then cut around 200 to 300. Anywhere in this range here can help clean up or make your amp a little bit more defined, and then add a slight boost around 2K, anywhere from 1 to 2K, even up as far as 5, depending on what you're trying to go for. There's no rules, but all this will hopefully help you. And I'd say definitely go about experimenting and see, having something like this is a really, really cool sound to play around with for high gains. So if you have any questions or any concerns, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to get back to it as soon as possible. Thanks.